Well, the story was interrupted by our end of our last session, and Haman has been humiliated by having to honor Mordecai publicly, and his family has seen this as a bad omen for him, and have said, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. This is almost like a prophetic word that they gave, perhaps not even knowing they were prophesying, even as Caiaphas prophesied without knowing it, that Jesus must die for the people, according to John chapter 11. So also Haman's family seems to be prophesying. They're seeing that this is not going to go well for Haman, and it certainly is not. At the end of chapter 6, verse 14, it says, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Now, Haman hadn't gotten much sleep. He'd spent the evening building a gallows, building a torture stake, really, on which to kill Mordecai. And then in the middle of the night, he'd gone to approach the king to get permission for that. And instead of being able to do that, he was forced to honor Mordecai publicly. That's how he spent his morning. And then apparently around noon, in all likelihood, it came time for this banquet that Esther had invited him to attend, him alone with the king. This was something that when he first heard about it, Haman thought this was a great privilege, a great honor to be alone with the king and the queen, just showing that he held a unique status below the royalty. But this turned out not to be such a great privilege for him, as it turns out. He didn't know that the people that he was trying to destroy, and the man particularly that he was trying to destroy, Mordecai, was related to the queen. And this is going to be revealed to him in this chapter. In chapter 7, so the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day, at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half my kingdom it shall be done. Then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. The reference to being sold, no doubt, has to do with the bribe of, 10,000, the amount of shekels of silver that were offered by Haman in order to...
talents.
Talents, not shekels, talents, 10,000 talents, was it? Silver. This was the price that had been paid to have them all killed. So she says, we've been sold to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. Now what she's saying is, this is a danger to my life and my people's lives. If it was only a matter of us going into slavery, I wouldn't disturb you with it, but it's something much more severe than that, where our lives are in danger. Although, if we had been sold away into slavery, the loss to the king would have been hard to compensate. That is, we Jews are actually of great value to the kingdom here. And if you lost us by having us sold away into slavery somewhere, it would have been a great loss to you. But I would have not bothered you with it if that were the only danger. Then King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who would dare to presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. As you can imagine, it had not been a good day for him already. And now this was going to ruin his whole day and his whole life. And he was terrified when he realized that he had been exposed. He didn't know until this moment that Esther was related to Mordecai or to the Jews, and that he had even threatened her. He had inadvertently plotted to kill the queen. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. Now, he apparently needed to think about this. Normally, in ordinary circumstances, he probably would have just declared, kill Haman then if he's threatening my queen. But this was a big accusation. This is a big thing. I mean, Haman was the prime minister. To have him executed would be to essentially have to replace him with somebody in a trusted post. This man, after all, had been his trusted minister, and he's going out to process this information that his prime minister has plotted to kill his queen. And the king arose and went out to the palace garden, and Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Now, it's hard to picture this, but people didn't sit in chairs in those days. They laid couches at the sides of low tables, and they ate that way. And so Esther was, of course, reclining on a couch, and Haman apparently, in petitioning her for his life, had, come over to her couch and draped himself over her couch in such a way that it looked somewhat compromising as the king saw it. And it says, the king said, will he also assault? And the word assault here means sexually molest, sexually assault the queen while I'm in the house. As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face, which means he was condemned to die. The servants came up and put a bag over his head. Haman was very ill-advised to go near the queen. I mean, he probably was going to die anyway, but it really enraged the king because no one's allowed to come near the queen. Only the eunuchs, who were men who were castrated and could not be, a danger to the purity of the harem, were allowed to go near the queens and the concubines of the king. No ordinary man could do so. In a sense, Haman was somewhat in danger being as near to the queen as he was just at the banquet, because ordinary man was not allowed to go near the queen, especially a very beautiful queen who might be thought to be somebody who'd be an allurement to another man. Haman made the mistake of apparently even touching her. You would never touch the queen. And although he was, of course, not trying to sexually assault her, it looked enough like that to the king to, have the king make this comment. And of course, when he made the comment, there was no question of what Haman said. It was the servants just came up and covered his head like, okay, I guess this guy's dead. And so Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf. Now he adds that little thing about Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf. Obviously the servants were favorable toward Mordecai and not toward Haman. And so he kind of rubs it in. He wanted to kill Mordecai. Mordecai's the one who saved your life, who exposed a plot against your life. The gallows is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him on it. And they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. And it seems like that should be the end of the story, but there's still 3 more chapters of sorts. Chapter 10 is only 3 verses long, but you'd think the story would end at this point, but there's still some unfinished business, namely that there's still a date set when the Jews are to be annihilated. And that date cannot be altered because that was a law of the Medes and Persians. So that problem has to be resolved yet. However, the story would end happily at this point and almost like a fairy tale. The bad guy, things went badly for him, and then the good guys lived happily ever after. And there's a sense in which this part of the story may be seen as a type of Christ. Mordecai being like Christ, and Haman being like the devil. And that the devil sought to destroy Christ by hanging him on a cross. And yet it was Satan who was destroyed at the cross. The very instrument that he thought would be the death of Jesus, and was the death of Jesus, was not the destruction of Jesus. It was the destruction of the devil himself. Through the cross, Jesus triumphed over the principalities and powers, it says in Colossians 2 and verse 15. It also says that through death, Jesus destroyed him that had the power of death, that is the devil. That is, through Jesus being crucified, he destroyed Satan. Hebrews 2:14 says. So the Bible teaches that by Satan's trying to destroy Jesus on the cross, Satan himself became destroyed on the cross, which might be the reason that we find this rather peculiar thing in the Old Testament when the Israelites were bitten by serpents and dying, that God told Moses to make a bronze serpent and hang it on a banner pole. A banner pole is a cross-shaped stick, a stick upright with a crossbeam to hang banners from. And in Hebrew, it was on a banner pole that this bronze serpent was placed. And we know that Jesus said in John 3:15 that as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. And so the serpent that was lifted up was like an emblem of what happened at the crucifixion of Christ, the Son of Man being lifted up on the cross. Yet a serpent is not a very good emblem of Christ, but of the devil. And it may well be that the reason for the hanging of the serpent in God's mind was to depict the fact that through the crucifixion of Christ, through Christ being lifted up, the serpent himself would be destroyed on the cross, through the cross. And so Haman has prepared this gibbet for Mordecai to be destroyed on. Instead, Haman is destroyed on it in a poetic kind of a justice. Now, chapter 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, as the estate of Haman, which was very wealthy, as we found earlier. In chapter 5, verse 11, Haman was talking about his great riches and the multitude of his children and the ways in which the king had promoted him. But all of that estate was now given to Mordecai, was given to Esther, excuse me. The enemy of Esther was given the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. So the house of Haman, a great estate, was given to Esther, and she appointed Mordecai over it. The king gave Mordecai his signet ring, which was, of course, the authority to issue laws and documents in the name of the king. The king's signet pressed into a wax seal was that which made something official. And this king had been worn by Haman. And now it's given to Mordecai, so he's made the prime minister in the place of Haman. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil plot of Haman the Agagite and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the provinces, the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come on my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Ahasuerus said to the queen Esther and to Mordecai, the Jew, "Indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree for the Jews, as you please, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For a letter which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke." So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded. To the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, which would include Judea, of course. To everyone in his own script, to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. He called in scribes to write in different languages. So Mordecai would dictate this law, and all the scribes would write in the various languages of the people to whom it would go out. This was before the time that the whole empire spoke one language. It was Alexander the Great that conquered this king. And actually, Xerxes lost some serious and important battles to the Greeks because Alexander was expanding at that time his influence. And after this time, Alexander the Great conquered the whole realm. Actually, I shouldn't say Alexander this time, it was actually Alexander's predecessors. The Greeks were expanding. This was not quite in the lifetime of Alexander himself, but the Greek Empire was pressing against the Persian Empire. And Xerxes fought some unsuccessful wars against the Greeks and lost ground, and that gave eventually power to Alexander to come and conquer the region. When Alexander did that, he actually imposed the Greek language on the entire empire. No king had done that previously, that is, imposed his own language on all of his conquered territories. So that within a generation or so after Alexander, the entire Mediterranean world spoke Greek. But previous to Alexander's time, every place had their own language. So when someone like the Babylonians or the Persians or the Assyrians conquered a region, they had to have persons who spoke the local language to govern that region. And so here also, when laws were sent out to all 127 provinces, they had to be written in the languages of the local people. So they had a lot of scribes would come in. Mordecai would dictate a law, and these scribes would write it down, of course, translate it into the various languages. It says, and he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds. By these letters the king permitted the Jews, who were in every city, to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. On one day, in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which was the month of Adar. Now that was the date that was set by Haman by the casting of lots. That day was the day that the Jews would be prepared. I think they were given about 8 months advance notice here, so they could actually fortify themselves. And if I understand correctly, and it's not entirely clear to me, but I think this is what was arranged, that what Haman had arranged was that anybody could rise up and kill Jews on that day. And this was by official decree of the king of Persia, so that the Jews would not be able to resist. If the Jews resisted, then all the armies of Persia would, they'd be fighting against the Jews. The Jews would be fighting against the decree of the king. It's more like a death sentence had been pronounced on the Jews. And just as a criminal cannot defend himself against the electric chair, against the police, so the Jews would not be permitted, without government reprisals, of defending themselves. So that's what changed. They were now given permission to defend themselves. Now, who was it that was supposed to be doing the killing of the Jews? This is not as clear to me as I wish it was, but I think what that money was about was that Haman had offered to pay anybody who kills Jews. And so it would be kind of on a voluntary basis for various people in the Persian Empire to rise up and kill their Jewish neighbors, and there was like a price on the Jews' head. It'd be like they'd get paid for killing Jews. And so every citizen had the opportunity of being a hitman and to be paid to kill his Jewish neighbors. However, the Jews were now given, and the Jews would not be allowed to resist. But now a decree was made that the Jews could resist. And obviously nobody had to kill Jews. It was a voluntary thing. People who wanted to rise and get paid for killing off the Jews could collect a fee. But now, of course, they're going to be fighting against armed resistance that have permission from the government to resist them. And, of course, they're fighting against the very people who are now ruling the country, Mordecai and Queen Esther, who are Jews. And so it now is not going to be people are not going to be quite so eager to rise up against the Jews, knowing but some did, and there was fighting. But I think that probably this decree and the fact that Mordecai and Esther were now known to be Jews in high government positions in Persia, no doubt changed a lot of people's minds who might otherwise have been willing to get involved in this slaughter. I think a lot of people decided to bow out because of this. We'll find that to be so. Anyway, it says a copy of the document, verse 13, was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. Then the couriers, who rode on royal horses, went out, hastened and pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan, the citadel. Now Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. Now notice the difference between the citizens' reaction to Haman's decree, which was back in chapter 3, when it was announced publicly that all the Jews were to be exterminated on a certain day. The very last line in chapter 3 said, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. It's like the city was not really favorable toward this decree, and they thought it was weird. They were confused. Why are we going to kill these decent Jewish folks? But now that a decree has gone out with equal publicity that the Jews can defend themselves, the city is happy about that. The Shushan rejoiced and was glad. And the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews, because fear of the Jews fell upon them. That is, they had fear of Mordecai, who was the prime minister and a Jew, the queen Esther, who was a Jew, and the king, who was quite favorable toward the Jews, obviously. If his queen was Jewish and his prime minister was Jewish, and so he was favorable toward the Jews. So if you rise up to kill the Jews, you're obviously taking sides against the king and the queen and the prime minister. Some still did it because it was legal for them to do that. They could make some money at it. But a lot of people decided, I don't know, I don't think so. And some of them even converted to Judaism. It says many of the people of the land became Jews. It reminds me of when Constantine, the emperor of Rome, became a Christian. Many people in Rome became Christians because the emperor is Christian. It's politically safer to be of the same religious convictions as the king. And so, although the king here is not said to have converted to Judaism, there was sufficient Jewish authority in the palace that some people thought it would be to their advantage to become Jews also, so they became proselytes, I guess. Chapter 9. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. So this was the fateful day. Would anyone rise up against the Jews in the present changed circumstances? Well, some did. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in the cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all the people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell on them. So all the local officials throughout all the 127 provinces, they helped the Jews. And there's this like civil war going on. And the local officials are supporting the Jews because they feared the prime minister, Mordecai.